Hi, welcome to my channel Cloud with Girish. In this video, I'm going to show you how to secure a REST API using AWS Cognito authorizer. I will use Cognito user pool for this authorization. While you can create this solution using AWS SAM and Cloud-formation, I will use AWS API Gateway via AWS console to configure this security for the API endpoint. With microservice architecture dominating the integration technology, there are millions of APIs out there. Some APIs are used in private network by internal application and some are offered in public platform. It is essential that these API endpoints are protected so that only authorized consumers can have access to the API. Let's look at the architecture design of our API. I have two architecture design here. The first design is an unsecured API endpoint, which is accessed by a consumer third party via API gateway. This API will use a serverless Lambda function to get the data from the DynamoDB, and it will return it to the invoking a consumer or third-party app. There is no security. Anybody who has access to the API endpoint can call this API. The second design here, as you can see, the API gateway is invoking Cognito to validate the token before passing the request to the Lambda and DynamoDB. So in this design pattern, API endpoint is secured using a Cognito authorizer. What that means is that a consumer third party who is invoking the API must have a valid access token to access the API results. OAuth 2 access token is one of the many ways that REST API endpoint can be secured to prevent unauthorized access to the API. AWS Cognito user pool provides OAuth 2 access token mechanism to secure the API endpoints. Basic authentication using username and password, which is not recommended, and API keys are few other mechanisms that can be implemented to secure the API endpoint depending on the use case. I will use AWS Cognito supported access token to secure the API endpoint in this workshop. There are two prereqs for this workshop. One is that you must have your DynamoDB table created. Another is that you must have a Lambda function that I will use to integrate as API endpoint. I already have a DynamoDB table with some data in it. If you want to learn about creating DynamoDB table using AWS SAM and AWS Cloud-formation, please watch my video on this workshop. Link is in the description. I also have a Lambda function created which will be used to integrate with API endpoint. If you want to learn about creating and testing Lambda function, please watch my video on Lambda workshop. Link is in the description for this as well. For this workshop, I'm going to use AWS console to create Cognito user pool. I will then create a user using the hosted UI provided by AWS for Cognito user pool. I will then log in using this user to get the access token. Then access token will be passed in the header when invoking the API endpoint. Let's get started. I'll first create a REST API GET endpoint. I'll validate the GET endpoint using Postman. Then I'll create Cognito user pool. We'll create a Cognito user pool authorizer for the REST API. I'll call the REST API secured using Cognito user pool. We'll authenticate the user using user pool, that is basically signing in and then getting the access token. Once I get the access token, I'll pass it in the authorized header in the API call. I'll then validate the secure API endpoint using Postman and will pass the authorizer header while invoking the API. First step is to log into AWS console and search for API Gateway service. Once you have found API Gateway service, let's create a REST API. You will see many options like HTTP, WebSocket, REST API. I'm going to create a REST API. Click on build and provide a name for the API. I'm going to name this API as get contact test API. I'm going to leave the endpoint type as regional. Let's create a resource next. I'm going to name this resource as all contacts. Once resource has been created, I'll create a method. Click on create method. From the drop down, I'm going to select a get method since I want to create a get to retrieve the contacts. I'm going to enable Lambda proxy integration and select my Lambda function. And I'm going to leave the default timeout as 29 seconds. Note that API endpoint is created, however, it is not secure. API key required is shown as false. Next, I need to deploy this API. So let's provide a stage name. It could be any name. I'm going to name it as test, and then I'm going to click on deploy. I have my API endpoint now. Let's test this endpoint to ensure that it is indeed fetching the contact records using the get API endpoint. I'm going to use VS Code Postman extension to test this endpoint. If you do not know how to enable the VS Code Postman extension, I will suggest looking at my another video on this topic. I'm going to leave the link for that also in the description. So from the Postman, I'm going to click on new HTTP request. I'm going to provide the API endpoint and click on send. I'm getting the record data back. That means my API endpoint is working as expected. Let's make this API endpoint secure so that only authorized client app can have access to this API. First, I need to create a Cognito user pool, log into AWS console and search for Cognito service. Once you have found Cognito service, click on create user pool. From here, I will click on configure sign-in experience tab. Please note this sign-in experience cannot be changed once created. I'm going to keep it simple and choose username. You can select multiple options here. You can select username, email, phone number. I will then select default password policy. Cognito default policy is 8 character long, contains one number, one special character, one uppercase and one lowercase. I'm going to go with this policy. I will select no MFA. In a production real life use cases, I strongly recommend to select require MFA. Since I'm trying to keep it simple, I'm going to select no multi-factor authentication. I'm going to enable the self-service account recovery using the default options here. And then in the next screen, when it comes to configure sign-up experience, I'm going to enable the self-registration. Enabling the self-registration will give me a hosted UI and it will allow me to sign up as a user and then use that user to sign in to get the access token. Next, I'm going to configure the message delivery. I have two options here for the email. I can use Amazon SES email service or I can use send email with Cognito. I'm going to again keep it simple and go with the send email with Cognito. Click next. Next, I'm going to give my user pool a name. I'm going to call it contact pool. And I'm going to also make sure that my use Cognito hosted UI option is checked. Next, I'm going to select a Cognito domain. I'm going to go with cloudwithgirish.auth.us2 amazoncognito.com. And then I'm going to provide an app client name here, and I will also provide a callback URL. Once I successfully sign in as an authenticated user, this is the URL that I will be redirected. I'm just using example.com. You can use any URL, really doesn't matter, because you can go to your browser and grab the access token from the URL. That's what I'm going to do. So let's move on and configure the advanced app client setting. I'm going to leave all the numbers here, the refresh, token expiration, etc. as default. And then in the next screen, OAuth 2.0 grant types, I'm going to select implicit grant. Next, I will be provided multiple screen of info based on all the options that I have selected, the information that I have provided. I will review all this information, and if everything is correct, I'm going to go ahead and click on create user pool. My user pool now has been created. Let's scroll down and select the app client. Click on the user pool and then app integration. Scroll down and get to the hosted UI. You will see an option which say view hosted UI. Click on that. It's going to open a new window in your browser, and it will be a simple sign up, sign in screen that is provided by AWS. That's why it's called hosted UI. You have limited customization functionality available to you. I'm going to leave it as it is, and I'm going to sign up with a new user calling test user. Once sign up and validated, this user will be used to log in and generate an access token that will be then passed in the header while invoking the API. Let's sign in using the user that we have just created. Now, if I get the error message that user is not confirmed, that means that user has not been confirmed after it was created. Multiple way to confirm it. If I would have configured my sign in, sign up experience, I would have provided an option where I'll get an OTP via my email, and I can provide the OTP and validate, confirm my user. But in this case, I did not. I wanted to keep it simple, so I didn't really enable that option. So I'm going to go to the user pool and confirm the user manually by going to the action menu and just say confirm account. Once user is confirmed, you can sign in using this user. Let's sign in, and this time I should be able to sign in successfully, and I'll get the callback URL that will also contain access token. This is how a typical access token looks like. It's a lot of characters. How do you get access token out of it? Well, there are two options. You can use a popular decoder like jot.io or on a similar, or just use a text editor and extract the access token. I typically use text edit. I just search for access token, extract the token value to pass in the API header via Postman. Next, now since we have our authorizer created, we're going to link this Cognito pool authorizer with the API. So I'm going to go back to my API and click on authorizer. I will then create an authorizer for this API. I'm going to name it as contact auth. I'm going to select authorizer type as Cognito, and then I'm going to provide the user pool name. This is the user pool that I have just created. I will also provide a header. I'm going to call it authorizer. This is where I will need to pass the value, which is the access token. So my authorizer has been created now. If you want, at this point, it can be tested via AWS console just by clicking the test authorizer and passing the token. If I have a valid token, I'll get a successful 200 response here. So next, let's go back to the API, edit the method request, and I'm going to add the authorization as contact auth. So now my authorizer is linked with the API method. Since we made the change to the API method, I'm going to deploy the API again so that updates are implemented. Now I'll go back to the Postman and I'm going to run the API again. I'm going to invoke it. As you can see, I'm getting an unauthorized response back. Reason is that this API endpoint is now secured using the Cognito authorizer, and I have not provided the access token in the header, and that's why I don't have access to the data written by this API. I'm going to add the header access token, and if my access token is valid, I will get the expected result. So let's invoke the API again, and as you will see, I'm getting the record back. It works as expected, and this is a secure API. I'm able to get the data back because I have provided a valid access token here. With this workshop, a REST API has been created. An endpoint has been secured using Cognito User Pool Authorizer. An access token was created by an authenticated user, and this access token was used to invoke the API securely. Another popular way to secure API is by using API key. If you are interested in learning about API key, please watch my video on API key topic. Link for this is in the description. Hope you have enjoyed this tutorial. I'm working on some other interesting content on various AWS topics. These will be posted soon. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.